Japan told Tokyo. They sank 2 American carriers at Coral Sea. One sailed into Midway, just after 9 in the morning, May 8, 1942. The Coral Sea, somewhere north of Australia, in water no fleet had ever fought over before. On the bridge of the Japanese carrier Zuikaku, an officer composed a message for Tokyo, and the message was a triumph. 2 American aircraft carriers attacked. 2 American aircraft carriers sunk. The wording went up the chain to Vice Admiral Shigeyoshi Inoue at Rabaul, and from Rabaul it went home, and in the offices of the Imperial Navy in Tokyo it was received the way good news is always received in the middle of a war, with relief, with certainty, with the quiet satisfaction of men who believe a problem has been solved. The problem had a name. The problem was the United States Pacific Fleet's aircraft carriers, the only ships left that could reach across the ocean and hurt Japan, and at Coral Sea the Japanese believed they had just removed 2 of them from the board, the American carrier Lexington and the American carrier Yorktown. Both reported destroyed. The accounting felt complete. One of those 2 carriers was, in fact, gone. The Lexington was burning, abandoned, going down by the bow with 216 of her men already dead. That part of the message was true. The other part was not. The Yorktown was not sunk. The Yorktown was hurt, badly hurt, with a bomb hole punched deep through her flight deck and dozens of her sailors dead below, and she was turning her bow toward Pearl Harbor at the best speed her engineers could give her. 25 days later she would be at Midway, and the men who had been told she was on the bottom of the Coral Sea would meet her again over a different ocean, on a morning that decided the war. This is the story of a victory report that was half true, and what the missing half cost. To understand why a message could be that wrong, you have to understand what the Battle of the Coral Sea actually was, because there had never been anything like it. For all of human history, when 2 fleets fought, they fought within sight of each other. Ships closed the distance, the guns came to bear, men on one deck could see the muzzle flashes on the other. At Coral Sea, in early May of 1942, that ended. The American and Japanese fleets fought for 4 days, and the surface ships never once saw one another. Not a single sailor on a single deck laid eyes on an enemy ship. The entire battle was fought by aircraft, launched from carriers 100 miles apart searching an empty sea for a target they could not see with their own eyes, and had to find on faith. That changes everything, including the truth. When a pilot dives on a ship through smoke and anti-aircraft fire, pulls out at the bottom of his run with the airframe shuddering and the ground crews of the world shooting at him, and climbs away to count what he hit, he is not a neutral instrument. He sees what a frightened, exhausted, hopeful man sees. He sees hits that were near misses. He sees a ship dead in the water that is actually still making way. He counts a carrier sunk that is in fact still floating, and still capable of launching the planes that will kill him later. The fog of war at Coral Sea was not a figure of speech. It was the literal condition of the battle. Nobody could confirm anything. Everybody reported what they believed. Here is what Japan was trying to do in those waters, and why it mattered. By the spring of 1942, Japan had won almost everything. Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, a swath of the Pacific so large that the maps in Tokyo looked like the maps of an empire that had already finished its work. The next move was south. Japan wanted Port Moresby, on the southern coast of New Guinea, because Port Moresby was the doorstep to Australia. Take it, and Japanese bombers would be in range of the Australian mainland. Take it, and the line that supplied the entire Allied position in the Southwest Pacific could be cut. The operation had a code name and a covering force, and at the centre of that covering force were 2 of the finest aircraft carriers in the Japanese Navy, the Shokaku and the Zukaku. Both had been at Pearl Harbor. Both were fast, modern, and crewed by veterans. Against them, the Americans could send 2 carriers and not 1 ship more. The American admiral who came to stop them was Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, flying his flag from the Yorktown. Fletcher is not a famous name today, and he was not a famous name then, and he would spend much of the rest of his life being second-guessed by men who were not in the water with him. But in early May of 1942, he was the man standing in the doorway to Australia with 2 carriers and an order to hold. Frank Jack Fletcher was born in 1885 in Marshalltown, Iowa, a railroad town in the flat middle of the country, about as far from the sea as a man can be born in America. His uncle had been an admiral, and the family sent the boy to the Naval Academy, and he graduated in 1906. He was not an aviator. That detail matters. Fletcher was a surface officer, a battleship and cruiserman by training, and he was commanding aircraft carriers in the first carrier war in history because there were not enough aviators senior enough to do it, and someone had to. He had won the Medal of Honor as a young officer at Veracruz in 1914, going back under fire to bring out refugees. He was brave, and he was careful, and the two things sat uneasily together in the minds of his critics, because a careful admiral in a desperate war is always going to look to someone like a timid one. Fletcher worried about his fuel. He worried about being caught with empty tanks 1,000 miles from anywhere. He pulled back when the situation was unclear, and he was criticised for it, then and for decades afterward. But in the Coral Sea, with the doorstep to Australia behind him, and 2 carriers, and not 1 ship more, the careful man held the line. That is the thing the second-guessers never quite forgave him for. He did the job, and he did it without drama, and history prefers its admirals dramatic. On May 7th, the battle opened with a mistake that turned into a victory. American search planes reported 2 carriers and 4 cruisers to the northwest. Fletcher launched almost everything he had. What the search planes had actually found was a much smaller force, and what the strike found instead, by something close to accident, was the light carrier Shoho, alone and exposed. 93 American aircraft fell on a single small carrier. She never had a chance. In minutes she was a wreck, settling, on fire from end to end, and it was in that moment that one of the few documented human voices of the entire battle came over the American radio circuit. The strike leader, Lieutenant Commander Robert Dixon, watched the Shoho go down, keyed his microphone and said the words that the United States Navy has never forgotten. Scratch 1 flat top. 3 words. The first Japanese carrier ever sunk by the United States in the war, announced not with a speech but with a pilot's grim shorthand, sent out over the airwaves to a fleet that needed to hear that the enemy could die too. But the Shoho was the small fight. The big carriers were still out there, and the next day they found each other. May 8th was the real battle. Both sides launched at almost the same hour. Both strikes found their targets. And both sides, at the end of the day, believed they had won more than they had. The American planes found the Shokaku and hit her hard. 3 bombs that tore open her flight deck and started fires that put her out of the war for months. The Zuikaku slipped into a rain squall and was never found by the American strike at all. But her air group was savaged. Her planes and her trained pilots ground down to a fraction of what she had sailed with. The Japanese, meanwhile, found the 2 American carriers, and here the day turned dark for the United States. The Lexington was the larger of the 2 American ships, an old battlecruiser hull converted to a carrier, big and proud and beloved by her crew, who called her the Lady Lex. She took 2 torpedoes and 2 bombs, and at first she absorbed them. Her damage control parties got the fires under control. She was making way. For a while it looked as though she would live. Then, in the early afternoon, with the immediate danger seemingly past, gasoline vapor that had leaked from ruptured aviation fuel lines found a source of ignition deep inside the ship, and the Lexington tore herself apart from within. One internal explosion, then another, then a series of them, walking through her like something alive. The fires that her crew had beaten back came roaring out of the depths of the ship beyond any hope of control. By evening the order came to abandon her. The men went over the side in good order, most of them, climbing down ropes into the warm sea, and an American destroyer came alongside and took them off, and then a second American destroyer fired the torpedoes that sent the Lexington to the bottom, so that the enemy could not have her. 216 of her sailors went down with her, or died in the explosions. The Lady Lex was gone. There is a detail from that abandonment that has stayed in the record because it is so strange and so human. The Lexington's crew left her so calmly, so without panic, that some of the men stopped at the ship's store on the way to the rail and helped themselves to ice cream, eating it as they waited their turn to climb down into the sea. The ship was dying under them, and they ate ice cream, because there was nothing left to do for her, and a man might as well, and because discipline that deep does not look like fear. It looks like sailors having a last cone on a warm afternoon while their home burns. Almost the entire crew got off. The navy that would win the war was already, in May of 1942, a navy whose men did not break. And that is the part of the Japanese message that was true. 1 American carrier sunk. The Yorktown was the other ship, and the Yorktown is where this story lives. She was hit too once by a single bomb that punched through her flight deck and detonated far below, killing or wounding dozens of men in the spaces it reached and starting fires of her own. But the Yorktown's fires were beaten. Her engineers held the propulsion. Her flight deck, holed but usable, was patched. By the end of the day she was steaming under her own power, recovering aircraft still a warship. The Japanese pilots who attacked her saw the bomb hit, saw the smoke, saw a carrier in distress and reported what frightened, hopeful men report. They reported her sunk. She was not sunk. She was wounded and alive and turning for home. So the message that went to Tokyo was, by the standard of what those pilots had actually seen, an honest message. 2 American carriers attacked, both reported destroyed. The men who sent it were not lying. They believed it. And belief, In a war fought entirely by aircraft, over an ocean where no one could check is a dangerous thing to mistake for fact. Here is something the history books do not always say out loud about Coral Sea. By the cold arithmetic of tonnage, Japan won. They sank a fleet carrier and a destroyer and an oiler. The Americans sank a light carrier. On paper, on the day, it was a Japanese tactical victory and the Japanese were entitled to feel they had come out ahead. But the paper was lying too, because the invasion of Port Moresby, the entire reason the Japanese fleet was in the Coral Sea at all, was turned back. For the first time in the war, a Japanese advance had been stopped. The doorstep to Australia held, and because the Shikaku was wrecked and needed months in the yard, and because the Zukaku had lost so many planes and pilots that she could not be made ready in time, neither of Japan's two newest, finest carriers would be available for the operation Japan was already planning for the following month, the operation against an atoll called Midway. That is the first cost of the half-true message. The Japanese walked away from Coral Sea believing they had sunk 2 American carriers and lost 1 small one, and that the score now stood firmly in their favour. They walked away counting the American carrier fleet as smaller than it was, and here is the deeper irony, the one that takes a moment to settle. At Midway, 4 weeks later, Japan would attack with 4 aircraft carriers. The Americans would meet them with 3. 4 against 3, a margin so thin that the entire battle would be decided in about 6 minutes of dive bombing. But Japan should have had 6 carriers at Midway, not 4. The 2 that were missing were the Shikaku and the Zuikaku, and they were missing because of the Coral Sea. The Shikaku had been bombed into the repair yard. The Zuikaku had come through the battle without a scratch on her hull, and was still kept out of Midway anyway, because her air group had been gutted, her veteran pilots killed in numbers Japan could not quickly replace, and a carrier with no trained aircrew is just a large target. So the battle Japan thought it had won in the Coral Sea quietly took 2 carriers out of the 6 it would need a month later. Japan went to Midway with 4 because of a victory it had celebrated. The Americans went with 3 because a ship they had been told was sunk had been rebuilt in 72 hours. 4 against 3. It should have been 6 against 2. The whole war balanced on that difference, and the difference was written, in part, in a victory report that counted wrong. The man who had proved them wrong was sitting in an office at Pearl Harbor, and he had not slept much. Admiral Nimitz had been commander of the Pacific Fleet for less than 5 months. He had taken the job on the last day of 1941, standing on the deck of a submarine in Pearl Harbor because the battleships that should have hosted the ceremony were sunk or burning around him. He was a calm man from the Texas Hill Country, soft-spoken, precise, a man who did not raise his voice and did not panic, which in the early months of 1942 was close to a superpower, and in the last week of May, he was handed a problem that came down to a single ship and a single number. American codebreakers, working in a basement at Pearl Harbor, had given Nimitz something close to a miracle. They had broken enough of the Japanese naval code to tell him that the next great blow was coming at Midway, and roughly when, and roughly how. Japan was going to send the heart of its carrier fleet against that tiny atoll, draw out what remained of the American carriers, and finish the job that Pearl Harbor had started. Nimitz knew it was coming. He intended to be waiting, but to spring the trap he needed carriers, and the cupboard was nearly bare. 2 carriers were steaming up from the South Pacific, and the third was the Yorktown. The Yorktown came into Pearl Harbor on the 27th of May, trailing a slick of oil, listing, her hull strained, her flight deck still showing the scar of the Coral Sea bomb. The yard workers who came aboard to survey the damage did the math the way professionals do, and the math said 90 days. 3 months in a repair yard to make her whole again. That was the honest estimate, the responsible estimate, the estimate any sensible navy in any normal time would have accepted. Nimitz looked at the estimate and the calendar and the intercepts that told him the Japanese fleet would be at Midway in a matter of days, and he made the decision that this entire story turns on. He did not have 90 days. He told the yard he had 3, 72 hours. Get her seaworthy, get her flight deck working, get her able to launch and recover aircraft and steam at fighting speed, and do it in 3 days, because in 3 days she had to sail. And here is the part of the story that belongs not to an admiral but to men whose names mostly did not survive. The Pearl Harbor Navy Yard put roughly 1,400 workers onto the Yorktown and they did not stop. They worked around the clock, day into day, welders and ship fitters and electricians and pipe fitters, in the heat and the dark of compartments that were still half flooded, standing in oily water, cutting and patching and shoring and rewiring. They did not have time to do it the right way. They did it the only way the clock allowed. Steel plates welded over holes that should have been properly cut and fitted, structural members shored with timber, power restored circuit by by men working in spaces where the air itself was foul. The city of Honolulu cut its own electrical power to give the yard what it needed. 3 days, they gave Nimitz his ship in 3 days. Nimitz did not stay in his office while they did it. He came down to the dry dock and went aboard, and the story goes that he stood in water that came up over his shoes, looking at the damage with the yard superintendent beside him, and asked the only question that mattered: could she fight? And the answer that came back was the answer of men who had decided that the responsible estimate and the necessary estimate were 2 different things, and that in the last week of May of 1942 only one of them counted. She could fight. They would see to it. When the Yorktown finally cast off her lines on the 30th of May, there were still close to 100 civilian yard workers aboard her, men in dungarees with no rank and no weapon, and no business steaming toward a battle, finishing welds and chasing down electrical faults as the ship cleared the harbour entrance, because the work was not done and there was no more time to do it in port. They rowed her out to sea, fixed what they could, and were taken off by a smaller ship before she ran west toward Midway. They are not in the history books. They turned a 90-day repair into a 72-hour repair, and then rowed the unfinished ship partway to the fight, and almost none of them ever told the story. Think about what that kind of quiet is. A man helps decide the most important naval battle of the century with a welding torch, and then goes home and talks about the weather. On the 30th of May, the Yorktown sailed out of Pearl Harbor with civilian yard workers still aboard, finishing repairs that could not be finished in port, riding her out to sea because there was no more time. Her captain was Elliot Buckmaster, a Virginian, a naval aviator, a man who had brought her home from the Coral Sea and would take her into the next fight without the luxury of a single day's rest. The ship that Japan had reported sunk 3 weeks earlier steamed west to a battle the Japanese believed they would fight against. At most, 2 American carriers. There were 3. If you have ever wondered how a battle that should have been a Japanese victory became the turning point of the entire Pacific War, this is one of the threads. The Japanese plan for Midway was built on assumptions, and one of those assumptions was that the American carrier force was weaker than it was. Coral Sea had told them so. They had counted the Yorktown as dead. They expected to find the Americans with 2 carriers, if the Americans showed up at all, and they expected to find them late, reacting, surprised. Instead, the Americans were waiting, forewarned by the codebreakers, with 3 carriers, one of them a ghost that should not have been there. I want to pause here, because the men of that generation rarely paused for themselves, and someone should. If your father or your grandfather served in the Pacific, on any ship, in any yard, in any uniform, his name belongs in the comments below. The 1,400 men who put the Yorktown back together in 72 hours mostly went home and never told anyone what they did. Do not let those stories disappear. On the morning of June 4th, 1942, the 2 fleets found each other off Midway, and once again it was a battle of aircraft searching an enormous ocean. The early American attacks were almost suicidal. Torpedo squadrons, flying low and slow in obsolete aircraft, went in against the Japanese carriers and were nearly annihilated. One of those squadrons was Torpedo Squadron 8, and it is worth slowing down for one of its men, because he saw the whole thing from a seat the United States Navy never intended him to have. His name was George Gay, Ensign George Henry Gay, born in 1917 in Waco, Texas, a young man who had been an airline mechanic and a teenager, working his way through Texas A&M before the war pulled him into a cockpit. On the morning of June 4th, he flew his torpedo plane straight into the heart of the Japanese fleet with the rest of Torpedo Squadron 8, and one by one the planes around him were shot down, until there were none. Every aircraft in the squadron was destroyed. Gay's plane was hit, his gunner killed, and he ditched in the sea in the middle of the enemy fleet, wounded, and pulled a black seat cushion over his head to hide from the Japanese ships steaming past. Of the 30 men of Torpedo Squadron 8 who flew that morning, he was the only one who lived. They had scored no hits. It looked, for a few terrible hours, like a slaughter with the Americans on the wrong end of it. And then, from his seat cushion in the water, George Gay watched the rest of the battle happen. He looked up and saw the American dive bombers fall out of the sky onto the Japanese carriers, and he watched the flight decks erupt, and he floated there in the oil and the wreckage of his own squadron, and saw, with his own eyes, the moment the Pacific War turned. He would be picked up the next day, the sole survivor of a squadron that had been wiped out to the last plane, and for the rest of his life he would be the man who had the worst seat and the best view in the history of naval warfare. The Torpedo Squadron scored no hits, but by going in low and drawing the Japanese fighters and the Japanese eyes down to the surface, they cleared the sky above for the dive bombers. They paid for the victory with almost every man, and a wounded ensign under a seat cushion lived to tell what their dying had bought. And then the dive bombers arrived. High above the American dive bombers that had been searching, that had nearly run out of fuel, that had found the Japanese carriers almost by chance pushed over into their dives at the exact moment the Japanese flight decks were crowded with armed and fueled aircraft being rearmed. In the space of about 6 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers were turned into burning wrecks: the Akagi, the Kaga, the Soryu. 3 of the 4 carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor gone in a single morning, and the Yorktown's air group was in that fight. The ship that had been reported sunk at Coral Sea sent her planes into the strike that broke the back of the Japanese carrier fleet. The 4th Japanese carrier, the Hiryu, was still alive, and she struck back, and the ship she found was the Yorktown. The Japanese pilots who attacked her that afternoon did not know they were attacking a ghost. They hit her with bombs and stopped her dead, and then a second wave came in with torpedoes and hit her again, and the Yorktown took on a list so severe that Captain Buckmaster gave the order to abandon ship. The crew went over the side, and then, in a detail that says everything about how much fight was left in that battered hull, the Yorktown refused to sink. She floated through the night and into the next day, listing but afloat, and a salvage party went back aboard to try to save her, because she had earned it. They were still fighting for her on June 6th, a salvage party back aboard, pumping, counter-flooding, fighting the list, beginning to believe she might be saved, when a Japanese submarine, the 0168, slipped through the destroyer screen and fired a spread of torpedoes. 2 of them passed under the destroyer Hammond, which was tied alongside the Yorktown, feeding her power and pumps, and struck the carrier. 1 hit the Hammond directly. The Hammond broke and went down in about 4 minutes, and when she sank, her own depth charges detonated in the water beneath the swimming survivors, and roughly 80 of her sailors died, many of them men who had already survived being thrown into the sea once. The Yorktown took her last wounds and held on through one more night, listing further and further, and at dawn on June 7th, 1942, she finally rolled over and went down in deep water, with her battle flag still up. So the Japanese were right in the end. The Yorktown did sink. They were just 26 days early and 1 decisive battle short. The carrier they buried at Coral Sea lived long enough to help destroy 4 Japanese carriers at Midway, and only then did she go down, for real, having changed the course of the war on her way to the bottom. Here is what the men in those Tokyo offices could not have understood when they read the good news from Coral Sea in May. The arithmetic of a single ship can decide a war. If the Yorktown had truly been sunk in the Coral Sea, the Americans would have met the Japanese at Midway with 2 carriers against 4, and the codebreaker's miracle might not have been enough. The margin at Midway was that thin. The Yorktown's presence is not a footnote. It is one of the reasons the Pacific War turned when it did, where it did, in favour of the side that 6 months earlier had been pulling its own battleships out of the mud at Pearl Harbor. And it happened because of a decision nobody had to make the brave way. Nimitz could have accepted the 90-day estimate. It was the responsible number. No one would have blamed him. He chose 3 days instead, and 1,400 men in a Hawaiian shipyard made the 3 days real, working in flooded compartments in foul air around the clock. And a captain named Buckmaster took the ship to sea before she was ready, because ready was a luxury the war would not allow. None of them is famous. The decision is barely remembered, but it is one of the quiet hinges the whole thing swung on. There is a temptation, looking back, to make the Japanese report at Coral Sea into a story about arrogance or incompetence, and it is neither. The men who reported the Yorktown sunk were brave aviators doing their best in the first battle of its kind ever fought, peering through smoke and fear at a target they could not confirm and reporting what they truly believed they saw. The failure was not in their courage, it was in the nature of the thing itself, a war fought blind by aircraft over an ocean where no one could ever be sure of anything, and where the difference between a carrier sunk and a carrier wounded was the difference between a victory report and the loss of the entire war. The Japanese counted 2 carriers. They had earned 1, the other one they had only frightened, and a frightened ship can come back. The Yorktown came back. She fought one more battle, the battle that turned the war, and then she let the sea take her. The men who put her back together in 3 days are gone now, and most of them are nameless. The captain who would not give up on her is gone. The pilots on both sides who fought blind over 2 oceans in the spring of 1942 are nearly all gone. What is left is the record, and the record says that on the 8th of May, a message went to Tokyo announcing 2 American carriers destroyed, and that the message was exactly half right, and that the half that was wrong helped lose Japan the war. If your father, your grandfather, your uncle, anyone in your family served in the Pacific in those years, on a carrier or a destroyer, in a shipyard at Pearl Harbor, or on a transport or in the air, leave their name in the comments below and tell us one thing about them. Not just the name, one thing they did, or one thing they said, or one thing you remember from a kitchen table a long time ago. The men who were there deserve more than a number in a battle report. The Yorktown taught a whole navy that a ship written off as dead can still decide everything. The men who served in her and in the 1,000 ships like her deserve to be remembered the same way, as more than a casualty count, as people. Leave their names, don't let them go down quietly.